Well, White Lotus season 2 has just ended and Succession season 4 hasn't started yet. So I was looking for something to watch on HBO, and lo and behold, I saw that a new documentary has just premiered that is extremely related to my interests. Call Me Miss Cleo. Experience the rise, fall, and reinvention of 90s TV psychic Miss Cleo. Known for her larger-than-life persona and memorable accent, Miss Cleo, born Yuri Del Harris, garnered a nationwide cult following on the Psychic Readers Network, which later came under fire for its alleged deceptive practices. Call Me Miss Cleo ultimately reveals the truth behind the ever-enigmatic woman who took TV by storm, only to abruptly disappear from public consciousness. Yeah, I couldn't hit play fast enough on that one. I was excited to see exactly how critical this documentary would be, both of Miss Cleo herself and also of professional psychics as an industry. As you know, I myself have been extremely critical of both. When Miss Cleo died in 2016, I wasn't super respectful. I straight up called her a con artist and pointed out the irony of her dying from cancer several decades after she stole a bunch of money from a nonprofit theater by pretending to have had cancer. I was also interested in whether or not this documentary would change my mind at all about Cleo. And I'm happy to say that, yes, it kind of did. So let's get into it. First of all, as a film, I would give this documentary a C, maybe a C minus, 2.5 stars out of 5. Very meh. It's disjointed. They jump back and forth between unrelated people and time periods and stories sometimes. And the creators made the completely baffling decision to heavily feature interviews with two actors who not only did not know Miss Cleo personally, but clearly knew next to nothing about her life. Raven-Symoné, for instance, is obviously learning on camera in real time details about Miss Cleo and then just reacting to what she's just been told. And it's like, why is this happening? She seems like a lovely person, but I really just do not care what Raven-Symoné thinks about literally just hearing that Miss Cleo was a lesbian or that Miss Cleo didn't think she made enough money. Like, who cares? So if you're not interested, in psychics or con artists or Miss Cleo, this might not be the documentary for you. I am very interested in those things, so I did feel like I got some value out of it. To answer those questions I had at the beginning, I found the documentary to be surprisingly critical of Miss Cleo. I was really expecting it to be much more of a fluff piece, but they actually did hit on most of the things that I was hoping to see, specifically like the con she ran at the nonprofit theater in Seattle before becoming Miss Cleo. In interviews with the people who knew her at that time, the viewer learns that, before she became Miss Cleo, she actually went by a number of different names. Yuri Cleomily, Yuri Del Harris, Yuri Perry, Ray Del Harris, Cleomily Perry, Yuri, and Ree Paris, or Ree Perry, as she was known in the mid-90s when she started putting on plays at the Langston Hughes Theater in Seattle. Those people attest that she did not have a Jamaican accent at all, that she told them she was born, raised, and educated in Los Angeles. In 1996, she did a play where she created the character of Miss Cleo, a Jamaican spiritualist psychic. Then she claimed that she had bone cancer, and she skipped town with the thousands of dollars that she was given to pay the cast and crew of her production. The next time these people saw her was on television, where her character was now shilling for the Psychic Readers Network. And that's where people, if you weren't around back then, people were encouraged to call a 1-800 number for their free psychic reading, which was only actually free for the first few minutes, after which they charged an exorbitant amount of money every minute you stayed on the phone. The documentary also did a good job, I think, of finding and interviewing former psychic readers who worked for that company. One of them I found completely fantastic because he was very open about the fact that he and his coworkers did not have psychic powers and that he participated in a horrific scam designed to squeeze as much money as possible from very desperate people, many of whom needed mental health services, not a fake psychic charging them $5.99 a minute or whatever. One thing I learned here that I didn't know was that in addition to just keeping these people on the phone for as long as possible, the employees were actually asked to get the names and addresses of every person who called in so that those people could then be added to a master list of suckers who could then be bilked again in the future. Pretty evil. I hate to admit it, but I did laugh at the story of what they would do if someone called in asking to speak to Miss Cleo. Apparently, even though these psychic readers worked from home alone, they would put the phone down and then wander around their living room calling out Miss Cleo for like as long as possible before coming back and being like, oh, she just left for lunch. It's so evil, but also kind of a little funny. Finally, the movie does cover the FTC lawsuit, which eventually shut down the Psychic Readers Network entirely by fining them for defrauding people out of millions of dollars. This is the part that I found most interesting because I actually did learn something here. I learned that Cleo wasn't in charge of the company, and she apparently had no say or control over their internal workings. So she was actually dropped from that FTC lawsuit because of that. And I found that really interesting because I didn't realize that. And it does make me slightly less angry at Miss Cleo specifically for defrauding all of these people. Unfortunately, that's about it for the criticism of psychics or Miss Cleo in this documentary. The documentary clearly wants us to feel as though Cleo's lack of direct control in the Psychic Readers Network should make us sympathize with her, but why? She was still the paid spokesperson who convinced all of those people to call in. The documentary also pretty uncritically accepts Miss Cleo's word that she was underpaid. But if that's true, why did she play this character for several years? And also, I cannot stress this enough. Everything we know about this woman suggests that she lied constantly about everything. She lied to her friends in Seattle about having bone cancer. And also she lied apparently about attending University of Southern California. She lied about being born in Jamaica and having an entire Jamaican accent. She lied about having psychic powers. How do I know that? Because psychic powers don't exist. Well, the interviews with the people she knew in Seattle are great. The documentary gives equal weight, if not maybe even more weight, to interviews with the people Cleo knew during and after her fame as Miss Cleo. And here's the other part where I did get a little sympathy for Cleo. After the Psychic Readers Network went under, she came out as a lesbian and she got involved in LGBT activism around Florida, which is great. And also, it makes it a little complicated. The documentary features interviews with all of these people she befriended during that time. And honestly, it felt a lot like listening to people who were like still in the cult. They didn't realize yet that they had been scammed. All of them wholeheartedly believed that Cleo had some kind of psychic powers. And further, they believed things like that she had multiple personalities that each talked in different ways and had different magical powers. One person almost reaches self-awareness in this documentary, saying something like, sure, some people might think that she just had mental problems like multiple personality disorder. And it's like, some people might think that she was just making all of this up and you bought it. Like, we can leave actual mental illness out of this and explain it with somebody who just lies a lot. Near the end of the documentary, we meet the woman who was supposedly the love of Miss Cleo's life. And I thought, here we go. A real relationship. maybe after she came out, Cleo found herself and finally was able to become honest with herself and someone else. So surely this woman will have insights. But it was so sad. She's just another poor dupe. She and Cleo dated for a bit, moved in together, and then one day, out of nowhere, Cleo just ghosted her. She just picked up and moved out, which is like kind of what happened in Seattle. She just picked up and left. How is that the love of her life? How is this not just another person who Cleo was able to fool for a while? One of the former colleagues definitely points out that once she left Seattle, Miss Cleo apparently just surrounded herself with white people. And seriously, in this documentary, there's not a single Black friend who is interviewed, nor do you see any in any photos or videos or recollections. And I love that the documentary included that, as well as the expertise of Andrea Shaw Nevins, who's a scholar of Caribbean and African diaspora studies. And she points out that every Jamaican person on the planet knew Miss Cleo was not Jamaican, but it's very, very easy to fool white people when it comes to that. And sure enough, Cleo's white friends completely believed everything she told them, including that she had some kind of Jamaican heritage. These friends also believed Cleo's stories of being abused as a child and teased at school, which is where things get even more complicated. Cleo lied about so much for so long that unfortunately we can't just accept anything she says at face value. But obviously, sure, she may very well have been abused as a child, and maybe that led to this life of lies. All we know about her childhood from the documentary is that she was sent to an all-girls boarding school, and there are no interviews with her family, her friends from back then, or any members of her family ever. None of them are even mentioned, aside from her talking about this abusive uncle. Cleo's ex-husband and 2 children never mentioned. She told The Advocate back in 2006 that at 19, she was married to a man with whom she bore a daughter, but the marriage ended before she turned 21. Since then, Harris has had 2 long-term relationships with women, which she refers to as marriages, and she gave birth to a second daughter in her late 20s. In 1997, she left her second wife, her last serious relationship, because she had become abusive toward Harris and her younger daughter. None of that is mentioned in the documentary. Cleo also told The Advocate that she had her first girlfriend in boarding school and that her parents knew she was gay and had no problem with it, which doesn't make it sound like she had all that bad of a childhood, even for a Black lesbian in the 70s. That Advocate piece is really interesting because it also says that Cleo says she made $450,000 over the 2 years that she worked for Psychic Readers Network, which she thinks is not a lot of money. Like, what? It's not the millions that the owners of that network pulled in, but that's a solid chunk of change, especially for living in Florida in the 90s. Add to that the fact that in 2002, she tried to sign with a different psychic company, but Florida sued to stop her from committing more fraud. All told, this documentary had its charms, but by not mentioning any of that stuff, it completely fails to truly hold Miss Cleo accountable for what was ultimately a lifetime of lying and defrauding millions of people with apparently zero sympathy. The guy who worked as a phone psychic for a little while had more compassion for the people they ripped off than Miss Cleo. She knew what was happening, and not only did she not care, but when the company that made her rich went under for massive fraud, she got herself excused from the lawsuit and then immediately tried to hook up with a different psychic network to continue the fraud. If you really want to paint Miss Cleo as a more complicated figure than just a fraud, let's hear from her actual children who were never even mentioned, or from any members of her real close family, and maybe from some psychiatrists who can tell us about what drives some people to lie about their entire existence. Maybe then I can find some real sympathy for a person who just got rich off of sad, gullible people.